Introduction to JDBC. Java has a special technology known as JDBC. Let me just tell you right now, it doesn't stand for anything. Some people want to make it stand for something, but the Sun literature clearly says it's just JDBC. Well, what is JDBC? Well, JDBC, as we'll discuss in a little bit more detail in the overview, allows you to connect your applications to databases so you can have Java enabled and database centric applications. In order to do that, you have to use what's called a provider. So we'll talk a little bit about JDBC providers and the various types that are out there, as well as how to work and configure those providers, specifically focusing in on something called a connection string. Once we go ahead and connect to a database, we want to issue some commands and work with the data, right? So we'll talk a little bit about executing commands and how that goes. And then I've compiled what I call 5 easy steps, or 5 steps for using JDBC to help you simplify your JDBC programming experience. So what exactly is JDBC? Well, overall speaking, as I said, JDBC is a series of classes found in the java.sql package that allows me to work with relational databases. I can run queries on databases, I can update databases, delete data out of databases, and basically what I can use is I can use JDBC to connect Windows applications or Java's JFrame applications, Swing applications. I could connect Java web-based applications. I could even connect the Java console-based application to a database and issue commands against a database utilizing JDBC. Now, in order to do that, we have to use something special called a provider. So I want to talk a little bit about providers and give you some idea of what they're all about and how do you get them. Think about what it is you need to do when you install a new piece of equipment, hardware, into your computer. Let's say you go out and you buy a new video card. What do you have to install to get your video card to work with your computer? You have to install a driver. If you install a joystick, if you install a new mouse, even if it's USB, a driver has to be installed, be it via a CD-ROM or on the fly via the USB, in order to get that to work. Because drivers connect your software to your hardware. Well, the reason why I talk a little bit about drivers that way is because the same model exists when we have a Java application over here and we have a database, RDMS, Relational Database Management System, over here. What connects the two is a provider. And depending on the relational database management system, be it Oracle or let's say Microsoft SQL Server, you need the appropriate provider. Now, ODBC is a standard that has been in place for a long time as part of an initiative called Universal Data Access. And an ODBC provider will allow you to connect to either something like Oracle or to Microsoft SQL. Okay? Any database that's ODBC compliant you can connect to. And Sun provides, when you download Java, it provides an ODBC provider for you. Also, I should say at this point that Sun also provides for you a driver to connect to Oracle. Now, it's been my personal experience that a lot of people are using Microsoft SQL Server. And what you can do is you can go to www.microsoft.com/SQL and download a third party or download Microsoft's JDBC provider for SQL Server. True, you could always use the standard compliant ODBC driver to connect to Microsoft SQL Server. However, utilizing Microsoft's JDBC driver will give you a significant performance increase. So the rule of thumb is when you're connecting your Java applications to some kind of relational database management system, you should try and see if that vendor has provided its own JDBC provider, or even check if some kind of a third-party company provides a JDBC driver for you. So now that I've kind of gone over that, what I'd like to do is actually start cracking open some Java code and start connecting to a database. Now, the first thing we have to do is configure a provider. We have to get a provider. Now, it's my personal experience, as I said earlier, that more people these days, for whatever reasons, maybe because of cost, accessibility, it's easy to get access to, people get trained on it, for whatever reason, most people that I've run across use Microsoft SQL Server as the backend database. Not only that, Microsoft SQL Server's JDBC driver does not come with Java. So for the purposes of this demonstration, I thought it would be cool to connect Java applications to Microsoft SQL Server and truly get a heterogeneous application. Heterogeneous meaning using different platforms. I'm using Java on the front end, Sun Java on the front end, but Microsoft SQL Server on the back end. And what you do is, as I said, you go to that www.microsoft.com/SQL, and off of that site, there is a link to download the JDBC Service Pack 3 driver from Microsoft. And when you download it, you get a nice little setup. And to install the driver, you simply double-click on it, and it goes through essentially a wizard that you will run. And you can see here I'm Microsoft SQL 2000 driver for JDBC Service Pack 3 setup. And you go through a series of, it's basically a wizard, and you just answer next, 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 next kind of thing. Here I say next. Now, the reason why it's asking me to remove the program is because I have already previously installed it. So I'm not going to remove mine. But you want to go ahead and you want to go through the wizard and say yes. So yes, I want to cancel because I've installed it. So what do you get after you install? Well, let me go into All Programs, and you'll see that there's the Microsoft SQL Server 2000 driver for JDBC, and you basically get an HTML help file and a PDF. And I don't have Adobe Acrobat installed, so that's why it looks like that, but that's pointing to a PDF file. Let me go ahead and open this and show you what you get. And this is it, nothing too exciting. It's simply just an HTML-based help file. The quick start is pretty good because it gives you a nice little information, kind of couple of steps on how to connect to the database, setting the class path, which we'll do. It talks about registering the driver, which we'll do, and talking about passing a connection URL or a connection string, which we're going to talk about. But let me show you what you get more importantly that you will be needing to use. If you go into the computer, My Computer, and I explore the My Computer, and I go into where I install the JDBC driver, the SQL JDBC driver. So let me go into my local disk, and I go into Program Files. And in Program Files, as I scroll down here, I get Microsoft SQL Server 2000 for JDBC. Let's go ahead and go in here and take a look at what we have. We have several things. We have the books online, the help files. That's basically where that's coming from. A little bit more information, a readme.txt, all that stuff. But here is the important thing. In the lib directory, let me go into there, we have a couple of files. Specifically, we have 3 jar files. A jar file is a Java archive file. And these 3 files are important and extremely necessary to get your application to work. And what we'll be doing shortly is we'll be configuring our class path to point to these files so we have access to them. As a matter of fact, to configure the class path, we can do one of 2 ways. We can go ahead and use the My Computer properties, or we could specify it inside of the command prompt. And to specify it inside of the command prompt, what we'll do is we'll say set class path, capitalize class path. Class path is an environmental variable for the computer, equal, and then what we're going to do is point it to those 3 files. But what I like to do instead of typing them out is I created a text file that had the path. So let me go ahead and bring up that text file. I hid that text file in the following directory. So I'll go into my C, Java, JDBC, and it is the classpath.txt file. And what I've done is I've pre-configured the class path. I say class path period means to look in the current class path. Now the class path environmental variable is semicolon delimited, so that's why we see the semicolon. And you'll see I'm specifying the program files, Microsoft SQL 2000 driver for jdbc/lib/msbase.jar. Okay, and you can see the second one points to the msutils.jar, and then so on and so on and so on, and then finally it points to the last one called the mssql.jar. So I like to do a select all, and I do a Control-C to copy it, and then I come over to my command prompt, and I say set, and then I paste the results of my copy into there. And you can't do Control-V on this one. You have to go ahead and actually go through the little icon here, and you hit Enter, and now I'm ready to use my class path. And to go ahead and test the fact that I've got this configured correctly, I've already written a little application to go ahead and test this. So let me move my mouse here, and let me do a dir. And let me bring up my window here so we could see this a little bit. And in here, I've got a little Java file that I called simplejdbc.java, and I've already compiled it, so I'm going to run it. And what it's going to do is it's going to query a database, and it's going to show a listing. It's going to list all of the cities in a particular table in the database. And as you can see, those cities just kind of flew past me fairly quick. But I promised you I did not write all these cities. They just kind of scrolled past me. So let's go ahead and see what I did in order to get that working. I don't need to look at this anymore. But what I do want to do is go into that one file. So let's go into that JDBC. And let me look at my simple JDBC file. So let's open that up with TextPad, our tool of choice here. And here is what has to happen. Okay, and this is what we're going to be going over here. Let's take a look at this. First of all, I told you all of the SQL, all of the JDBC stuff, for the most part at least, is found in java.sql. So you could see my very first line there is to import that necessary package. The next thing I did is I created a class, and I have a main method. So this is a very simple example. Now, the first thing that you have to do when working with the database is load the driver. And this step here is loading the driver. You use the class.forName method. There is actually a class called the class. And it's kind of funny. Let me duck down here, and let me open up the online documentation to show you the class. The class, let me maximize this, is actually found in java.lang. Okay, and if you recall, java.lang is the fundamental package. It's where all of the base Java functionality lives. And there's actually a class called class. It's kind of funky, but it's true. It's in there. And we can see it's a public final class. Final, you can't instantiate it. And it inherits directly from java.lang.object, true to how Java's supposed to work. And an instance of the class represents classes and interfaces in a running Java application. And there is a method in there called forName, and it's static, which would make sense because we don't instantiate an instance of the class. We can simply say class.forName. And what this does, and I passed a string to it, is it returns the class object associated with the class interface with the given name, where the current loader denotes the defining class loader. And it is highly used. In this particular example, the class is used to go ahead and install and register a JDBC driver. And in this example, the JDBC driver's name is com Microsoft jdbc.sqlserver.sql driver. Now that is a mouthful, I know, and you might be going, well, where in the world did you find that? Because class.forename, well, fine, I'll give you that. That comes right out of the Java API. But I bet you I could scour the Java API online documentation and never find a reference to that. And you know what? You would absolutely be correct. And this is where you absolutely get that information from the online documentation. And they start talking about in the online documentation that came with the SQL Server Service Pack 3 JDBC driver. The first step is to go ahead and set the class path. And that's what we did. We set our class path, and our class path now points to these 3 jar files that come with Microsoft. And they give you a nice little example of how to do that in Windows. And basically what I did was I copied this whole line here, and now I do a Control-C, and I'll do it again, which is not a problem. I did a Control-C, and then I type set, and then I go into the little icon here, the window property, do a paste, and boom, it's right in there for me. Okay, so I have the ability to just copy and paste it just like that. So go ahead and make sure you do that. Oop, it looks like I didn't grab all of it correctly because there was a line break, but that's not a problem at all. Let me copy it again. Copy, because I want you to see me do this. And I type set, and I'm going to go ahead and do a edit, paste, and let me go ahead and hit back because there is a space here. So I'm going to make sure I do this correctly. It's kind of not copying very well because what it is that's why I put it inside of my text file, but I can live with that. Let's see. And I can just go ahead and finish this and say slash lib and then slash the name of the final jar file. And in this example, or this case, the final jar file is mssqlserver.jar. And if you know a little bit about MS SQL Server, you would know that there is a service that makes SQL Server run called MS SQL Server, and that jar file connects into that service. So mssqlserver.jar. Okay, and then I went ahead and enter, and it worked just fine. So I just wanted you to see where I'm getting this stuff from. It's coming right out of the documentation. And that's always a big thing with me in this course, is always pointing you to where I'm getting stuff from in the documentation. So when you're at work, you know how to do this. Step 2 is to register the driver. And to register the driver, they go ahead and tell you exactly what to do. As a matter of fact, this whole line is a copy paste. You don't even have to really, understand it fully. Just copy and paste it, put it into your code because you have to register a driver, and this is what does it. Using the class.forename, you must specify the driver name. Well, what's the driver name? Microsoft JDBC, blah, blah, blah. Where are you getting that from? You're getting it from the online documentation. So that stuff comes right out of the documentation. The next thing you have to do is you have to configure a connection. And that's what I want to start talking about next, is starting to come up with how do we configure a connection and how do we know how to tell our driver to look at a particular database. Now, the connection string is a very important property that we configure utilizing our driver manager .getConnection method. Because what that does is well, first of all, let me back up and let's take a look at what the driver manager does. So let's go into the online documentation. So I'm going to bring up my online documentation and let me scroll down to java.sql. And it'll eventually, ooh, a little too quick there. Okay, java.sql. And let's take a look at what's available to us. Well, we've got a lot of stuff here. We've got blobs, which stands for binary large objects. We've got callable statements, database metadata. We have several interfaces that are very useful to us, which we'll go over in a little bit. But I want to focus in on this driver manager class. The driver manager class has the ability to give me a connection. which establishes an open connection to the data source. As part of its initialization, the driver manager class will attempt to load the driver referenced in the system, okay, thus allowing me to customize my JDBC drivers, etc. And let's take a look at what the get connection does. Get connection attempts to establish a connection to the given database URL. And it returns, that's what this means here if you recall, it returns a connection. The database URL is the connection string that specifies the name of the server and any other optional or mandatory information like login ID and password. So let's see what we have available to us in terms of configuring the connection string. And in order to do that, we must go back to the documentation. So I'm going to go to the using the SQL 2000 driver section, and let's take a look at connecting through the specifying the connection property, okay? And you can come down and read about it, and there are some connection string properties. And here we can see we can do things like specify a database name. Let me scroll that up, which is optional, by the way, because you could specify a database name in a query. The host process, the net address. You could specify the password, which is mandatory, not optional. An optional port number. You can specify some other things like, let me come on down here, the server name, mandatory, the username, mandatory, okay, and the workstation ID if necessary. And as I scroll up, you can see what you do is you specify in a name value pair or a property value pair. And let's take a look at an example of how to connect through the connection string. We see we have got URL examples, and here we can see down at the bottom, this is such an example. Scroll this over here. JDBC : Microsoft : SQL Server, the name of the server and the port. And this is the kind of stuff, folks, that you just do verbatim. It works like this. You either do it exactly as the documentation tells you to, or it will not work. Bottom line. Semicolon, user and password. So I basically went ahead and just copied and pasted it. Really did. Here is the database server. My server name is Robert, just my computer name, comma, the user ID to connect to the server, SA, and a password, and that is my password. And the driver manager dot get connection returns to me a connection here, and it attempts to try and establish that connection. Okay, so step number 1, register the driver. Step number 2 is basically load the driver and establish a connection. Now, it's not just enough to go ahead and establish a connection. What you also want to do is you want to run a query, or you want to run an insert or an update or a delete. And in order to do that, you have to create a special thing called a statement object. So let's go into the documentation. Again, I'm always going to bring you back to the documentation. It's very critical. You can see here under interfaces, we have a statement. And what exactly is a statement used for? It is the object used for executing static SQL statements and returning the results it produces. And in order to establish and get a statement, you call the connection object's create statement method. Let's take a look at that in the documentation so you can see where I'm coming from with that. Scroll up. Here we have the connection interface, the connection object that we created. And in here, it will have a method called create statement. There's several of them that have been overloaded, several create statements that return statements. Return a statement, return a statement. So that's why I can say statement st equals con.create statement. Now, once I have a statement, I need to go ahead and execute that statement. So the statement has an execute query method, which is utilized for running database queries. Let's take a look at that in the documentation. Very important. Let's come back to our statement. And actually, there's a couple of various execute methods that I want to talk about. Let's take a look. Here we have a simple execute method. Let's just take a look at the basic one here. Executes the given SQL statement, which may return multiple results. All right, that's execute. Notice you could specify an execute with a string and some kind of an integer for generated keys. You could specify column index as an array. Okay, now look at this one. This was what I want to focus on here. Execute update. Let me back up here because this is the one I'm using. Execute update, which just takes a string. And listen to this. Execute update executes given SQL statements that are going to be inserts, updates, or deletes. So execute update is for executing insert, update, and delete SQL statements. The one I'm using actually is execute query, which is just for queries. So it's important that you see that there's a delineation between execute query, which is just for querying, and execute updates, which is for inserting database data, updating it, and deleting it. And here's the big thing too. The execute query returns to you a single result set object. You see that result set? Where the execute update only gives you an integer back. That's why Sun makes the delineation here. So what I do is it's basically steps. Register the driver, load the driver, and establish a connection. Use that connection to create a statement which allows you to execute updates or queries. Here I'm saying simply select distinct from northwind.dbo.customers. The Northwind database is part of SQL Server. It returns to me a result set. Now what I have to do then when I get a result set is I have to iterate through that result set. And in order to iterate through the result set, I use the next method. So let's go back and let's take a look at result set here. Let me click on result set. See what we have. The result set is like a little table. I scrolled past it fairly quickly. The result set is a table that contains the result of your query. It's an in-memory table. A table of data representing a database result, which is generated by executing a statement that queries the database, essentially a select statement. Okay, so you have to understand that the results of your query come back as a little table, and you have to iterate through that table. And there's some great examples here, some things for you to read about. Let's go ahead and take a look at some of the methods here. There's a lot of them, and I want to jump down to the next method. And we're going to talk about some of these get methods here in a second. But the next method is important because what that does is that moves me through the query. So there's too much here, so I'm just going to, now of course I just overshot the thing. Here we go. I thought I just saw it, and it is here. Whew, that was that was a little bit of work. It moves the cursor down one row from its current position. Basically moves through this table called a result set, and it returns a Boolean. That's why here I'm using a while loop. So while I am true, move through and print out the result set. Now, what is getString? Well, getString helps me extract data from this result set. And there's, depending on the data type, many various get methods like get Unicode stream, get type, get timestamp, get time. It all depends on what you're querying out. Get string, that's what I'm using. You specify the column name, or you specify an integer, okay, like column 1, column 2, column 3. Get short if it's, short in data types. Get references, get objects. I mean, just for about any data type that's out there, get long, there's an appropriate get method that helps me to loop through it. The next thing I do is I close the statement because I'm finished with it. You always have to make sure you close the statement. Then, and I'm going to come back to this here in a second, you close your connection. So the question is, why am I catching these two SQL or these two exceptions? I'm catching the class.found exception, and I'm classing the SQL exception. Why am I doing that? Well, I'll tell you. Bottom line is I have to. My application will not compile unless I catch them. Let's jump back into the documentation. Let me jump up to java.lang, and let's go back to that class.forename. method. So here's the class, and let me click in that. Come down to the forName method, and look at this. ForName throws class not found exception. So I absolutely have to deal with the class not found exception because I'm utilizing the class.formName method. Now the rest of the SQL commands that I'm using, if we go back into the java.sql names package, java.sql, and let's take a look at something like, the driver manager, and we'll take a look at its getConnection method. GetConnection, put in a string, it throws SQL exception. As a matter of fact, everything in this package throws the SQL exception. Anytime you use it, you're going to have to throw SQL exception. Anytime you use any of the methods involved in this package, you're going to have to throw SQL exception. And it's important because the reason why you have to throw it and catch it is because many errors can happen when you're writing database applications, like the name of the database server is wrong, the database you're trying to query doesn't exist, or the network is down. There could be many things. Now, something else I want to do is show you about metadata. Metadata is information about the connection. So I already showed you what the results of this application is, and it'll go ahead and do its thing, and boom, it's querying. Now, you see down here where it says Microsoft SQL Server? It's the name of the database product that I'm using. Well, how am I getting that? Well, over here, I'm using my connection object, and I'm calling the getMetadata method. And the getMetadata of my connection object, let's take a look at what it gives me. So I go to my connection object, my connection, and let's take a look at what the getMetadata method does. It returns to me a database metadata object, which gives me essentially information about the connection. And one of the things that I can get about the connection, various things actually, information about it like, how about, let's take a look at the various get methods that we have available to us here. Did I go into the right one? Let's see that. Get database metadata. And we'll scroll down here, and here are the attributes. Let's jump into the methods. So let me just scroll this down a little bit better. Okay, so what do I have available to me? Well, I have get database major version, which gives me information about the underlying version. Get the minor version, get the product name. Well, if we take a look at it, lo and behold, I'm using get database product name, which returns to me Microsoft SQL Server down here at the bottom. So that's a nice little overview of utilizing Sun's JDBC's technology. What I've gone ahead and done is I've prepared for you some 5 steps for using JDBC. Now in this example, I'm using the JDBC ODBC bridge that comes with Sun Microsystems Java SDK. And you can basically load this to connect to any ODBC compliant database. Let me tell you, SQL Server 7, SQL Server 2000, and Oracle, this will work for all of them. So I went ahead and gave you this very fundamental driver. So step 1 is use the class.forName to go ahead and load the driver. Then what you need to do in step 2 is create a connection object, create a database connection, and you use the driver manager.getConnection method to do that, passing in the URL to the database. Now the reason why I didn't put a specific one in there is because depending on what your database is, well, that URL is going to be a little bit different. You have to check the associated documentation. Then in order to query, you go ahead and create a statement, because you need a statement to do everything. You have to create some kind of a statement object to execute your statements. Then what you're going to do, and I just went ahead with the example of queries, you're going to create a result set, and you're going to use your statement object that you created in step 3 to execute query. And I just made up some little example here. Now remember, there's execute update for inserts, deletes, and updates. Then you do something with your data, like iterate through it. And then don't forget to close. This is a sixth one that I've added to it. Don't forget to close your statement and close your connection. In an introduction to JDBC, went over some of the key things to know about JDBC, specifically what it is, what's it all about, how you can use JDBC to connect to databases. Then I talked to you a little bit about the providers, and that the fact that there were two main providers, the ODBC provider, which comes with the JDBC classes and comes with the SDK. It also comes with the Oracle. Let me just remind you of that. But I showed you how to get the SQL download drivers from Microsoft.com/SQL, install them, and utilize those. Then once you've loaded your driver, you have to establish a connection. And you establish the connection by providing it information like the name of the server and some authentication information. And that's all done using the connection string. Then you have to execute your commands. And you basically have a couple of things to choose from. Do you want to execute a query or do you want to execute an update? If you're querying the database, you execute the query. If you're inserting data into the database or deleting it or whatnot, then you want to execute the update statement. And finally, I showed you the 6 steps necessary to using JDBC. Originally there were 5, but I decided to add that little extra one just so I was extra clear about what I was talking about with you. Well, I hope you found this informative, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.